Rehabilitating the Body Politique, Palestinian Politics, and Models for Return. And so in this panel, we'll be hearing a bit more about sort of ideas and political imaginations, which is quite fitting given that at the end of one of our last talks, we were told that this was a topic unsolved or a kind of question raised in many of the discussions we've been having. And so for this panel, we will be having two panelists alongside a moderator. The moderator is Professor Leila Farsakh, who is an associate professor in political science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and Occupation, and editor of Commemorating the Naksa, Evoking the Nakba, a special volume of Electronic Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, as well as of numerous journal articles on the political economy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on the one-state solution. Dr. Farsakh holds a PhD from the University of London and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, UK. She has also worked with a number of international organizations, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in Paris, and since 2008 has been a senior research fellow at the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University in the West Bank. In 2001, Dr. Farsakh won the Peace and Justice Award from the Cambridge Peace Commission in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And our two panelists today are going to be first Sarah Ahmoud, presenting the paper, Who is a Palestinian? Political Representation of the Shatat in the Homeland. Sarah Ahmoud is a doctoral student in social activist anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Prior to working in Palestine, Sarah worked with indigenous communities in Guatemala, resisting state violence and neocolonial land appropriation in the aftermath of the Civil War and genocide of indigenous peoples. She is currently a National Science Foundation Fellow, a 2013-14 Palestinian American Research Center Fellow, and an organizer for the UT, University of Texas, Palestine Solidarity Committee, and the Austin BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Coalition. I think something just went wrong with this. Sorry about that. Finally, the second panelist will be Sadia Ahsanuddin, who will be presenting a paper entitled Restitution in the Land of Milk and Honey, Implementing the Palestinian Right of Return via Israeli-Palestinian Federalism. Sadia Ahsanuddin is a New York-based writer and researcher. Sadia graduated from Harvard College in 2009, where she worked as a research assistant with the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. Since then, she has interned with the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization and worked at the Brennan Center for Justice. Sadia has written for a variety of online publications, including Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, AI Monitor, and the Islamic Monthly. Much of her work is focused on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Please join me in welcoming the next panel.
Hi, I would like to start also by thanking the organizers. I think you did a great job in organizing this conference, and thank you for inviting me. I also assume that the public is quite tired, and you're wondering how the last session might or might not solve the problem once and for all. I will not be able to solve it, nor the panelists, but I think we do address a very important topic that cannot be avoided in any discussion of right of return or of how we can move forward, and that's basically rehabilitating the body politics, or Palestinian body politics. What I will do is, for the sake of time, I will just give an overview of what are the major issues when we're discussing something like rehabilitating Palestinian body politics, just for 10 minutes, and then I will allow the speakers, each one, to have 15 minutes to present their work, not 20, if that's fine. And then I'm going to open it for public, because I don't think you're interested in my comments as much as you're interested in having questions. I can give my comments on the papers, but I think it's important for you to hear what are your questions. Now, it is indeed a big challenge today to talk about rehabilitating the Palestinian body politics. It's a big challenge because politically, the Palestinians, in a certain way, have never been in such a bad situation since 1948 as it is today, from a political point of view. We're living an entrenchment of physical fragmentation, not just Palestinian diaspora and Palestinian refugees with Palestinians inside the West Bank and Gaza, but also between the West Bank and Gaza and inside 48. But we're also witnessing and living a very horrendous political fragmentation, best exemplified in having a government in the West Bank called Palestinian Authority under Fatah, and Hamas in Gaza. And despite all attempt to reconcile between them and the signature of various reconciliation agreements, they have not yet signed, that have not been implemented. And it's a political fragmentation, not just in terms of having two different bodies in two different places, but there is a big challenge with regards how to move forward with the Palestinian national project. So on the one hand, we have the Palestinian leadership today, whether Hamas or Fatah in the West Bank, endorsing and protecting the right of return, but de facto endorsing a state project, the idea of sovereignty and national independence, a project that they endorsed 25 years ago because that was the price of historical compromise. Now, I know I got a very bad slamming the past 2 days, how bad this idea of a state is. I don't think it was a bad idea. It was just an idea that whose historical moment has passed to the disadvantage of Palestinians, maybe. But I think we need to put it in historical context how much the idea of a Palestinian state on part of Palestine was an idea that took lots of sacrifice and lots of thinking and lots of preparation and was Palestinian historical compromise in 1988 that they hoped to cash through Oslo, but in which after 20 years of Oslo, we ended up without a state. And there today we find a big dilemma that on the one hand we're talking a state discourse and a sovereignty discourse, a national independence discourse, which is also endorsed by international law, by the international political system, and a reality on the ground whereby we don't have a state and what we have is a Bantustans or various Bantustans and no political sovereignty, but actually some political autonomy, and even that within a settler colonial state that has been further entrenched rather than retreated. So we have today in the Palestinian leadership what it is facing is really three major challenges which anybody discussing a means to rehabilitate the Palestinian body politics needs to address. First of all, we have a crisis of representation. We have a crisis of representation because Oslo prioritized the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza over the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which represents all the Palestinians. And as you will see, one of the papers, a paper by Sarah Ahmoud, will try to address how much it is important to rehabilitate the PLO, revive the Palestinian National Council as the only body, Palestinian body, capable of representing the various voices of the Palestinians, be it in the Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza, or the Palestinian who are citizens of Israel. This crisis of representation is particularly acute, not only because you need to revive the PLO, but also because we're talking about a generational shift that needs to happen and is happening, and maybe the youth are indicating means by which this can be rehabilitated and reinvented, but also a different way of doing politics. The second crisis we're facing is the crisis of Palestinian political project, Palestinian national political project. We've talked in the earlier session about this tension in the Palestinian national movement and Palestinian struggle between liberation and national independence. This is not a new tension. This is a tension that existed ever since the Nakba. Palestinians went for liberation up until 1967, with the creation of the PLO in 1964, and above all with the taking over of the PLO by a young generation at the time of freedom fighters, of people like Fatah and George Habash and Popular Front, people from Fatah and the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, and the Communist Party, a number of political parties in an era where national liberation was a right and not fighting terrorism or insurgents. It was called resistance and a legitimate resistance. In that context, they also were talking about liberation, and the PLO's program was the liberation of Palestine for the sake of creating a democratic society, which is then transferred into a democratic state, inclusive of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. This is an important project, but it got sacrificed. I will not, maybe sacrifice is a strong word, but got put on the shelves because it did not have any political a currency at the time. And I think and the PLO went for the sake of national liberation because that's the best way you can get at the time for the sake of having total liberation. I think today we've tried the state project. The state project came to its fulfillment. It provided its failure. It cannot be achieved because Israel is not interested and not willing to have any Palestinian state or any Palestinian right to self-determination. So I think today when we're talking about rehabilitating Palestinian body politics, we're also talking about rehabilitating and reinterpreting what liberation means. Liberation can no longer mean national independence in a sovereign state, but it also cannot mean something without some territorial and some physical representation. What does the physical representation mean? I think any talk about redefining liberation today means to focus and cannot but be centered over a debate on rights. And rights and needs to be constituted in a context in which we redefine the concept of self-determination rather than negate the concept of self-determination. We are moving to a phase whereby we try to assert self-determination through territoriality and sovereignty and failed, but we also reached a historical period, globally and also regionally, in which we can start to think about self-determination in a deterritorialized way. It's not that only now we can start. It's important to bear in mind that this realization is coming not because we did something wrong in the past, but rather because we are in a new stage whereby we realize the territorial state cannot give us what we are hoping for because we are in a different historical period. But then what does the deterritorializing self-determination mean? I think it means two things: acknowledging that we have individual and collective rights of all citizens in a single state, which is in Israel-Palestine today. This is something very important, but things that needs to be fleshed out. And as we heard in the keynote speakers earlier and also in the panel earlier, it's not very easy to panel it and detail it in some precision. Maybe we don't need to. It's a process, it's true, but it also needs to be something concretized and thought about in some very difficult ways about what it means to have collective rights, what does it mean to have autonomy, how can we call for a one state for all its citizens without compromising the national project, how can self-determination be meaningful and have autonomy when we're living with our oppressor and not. We don't have solutions, but I think we are moving in the right direction, deterritorializing notion of self-determination, re-emphasizing a notion of rights of all citizens in a single state, and talking about individual and collective rights. Now, the two panelists, we're going to start off with Sarah, who's going to talk about how there is an attempt to rehabilitate Palestinian body politics by encouraging and seeing that there are initiatives among the youth to re-energize and reactivate the Palestinian National Council. And then we're going to move on to hear Sadia's intervention on how we can create a one state, a binational state that can be federalist and can try to address the collective individual rights of all those living in Palestine. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference. I am humbled by the invitation to participate and feel extremely privileged to be here with all of you today. I'd also like to thank local activist Roberta Kaufman for so generously opening up her home to me while I'm staying in Boston. I want to start with my own story of diaspora. 5 years ago, I found myself wandering the cobblestone streets of Trinidad, a small town in the Sancti Spiritus province of central Cuba. The decline of the Ottoman Empire prompted many Palestinians to migrate in search of economic opportunity. Like many of the men in my grandfather's generation, my great-uncle Mahmoud migrated to Latin America in 1918 to help support our family in Turmasaya, a small village between Nablus and Ramallah. It took him 3 months by freight ship to arrive in Havana. He went on to change his name to Jose Julian Ali and to become, I'm not sure why exactly Jose Julian Ali, and to become one of the wealthiest men in Cuba, owning several farms, a cattle ranch, and one of the biggest cigar factories on the island. He lost everything during the revolution. After the Nakba, my great-uncle was barred from returning home. Our family lost touch with Jose Julian Ali, his wife and 8 children sometime around the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. The last letter my grandfather received from him was in 1954. Here I was, half a century later, in Trinidad de Cuba, with nothing but a name and this history, searching for my Palestinian family. Would they embrace me as their kin after so much time had passed? How assimilated would they be into Cuban identity and culture? Would they still identify themselves as Palestinian after nearly a century of separation from the homeland? Was the dream of return something that my uncle had passed on to his children? Who is a member of the Palestinian diaspora today, and what makes them members? What motivates people culturally or politically to imagine themselves as Palestinian and part of a diaspora? This paper is in part a reflection on the answers to these questions. It is about how we collectively imagine Palestinian identity today and the role of that imaginary in attaining Palestinian sovereignty and implementing the right of return. First, I'm going to define diaspora theory and politics. Next, I'll discuss Palestinian diasporic politics historically. And finally, I'll look at the potential for popular registration campaign, a new initiative of the youth of Palestine today, and calls for a renewed PNC election to reinvigorate a politics of Palestinian diaspora. Diaspora theory and politics. The concept diaspora is widely used as a way to conceive of people removed or exiled from a common territorial region and dispersed throughout the world. Importantly, beyond the historical fact of diaspora, from its inception, the concept has been deeply tied to political projects involved in creating consciousness and solidarity across national borders. Solidarities based on shared histories of oppression and racial exclusion, resistance to colonialism, resilience, and survival. Early formulations of African diaspora, for instance, trace the dispersal and attendant racialization of Black bodies through histories of slavery, colonialism, forced and voluntary migration, contestation, and resistance, mobilized by the transatlantic slave trade and racial capitalism. This vision became the basis for organizing radical political projects ranging from Pan-Africanism to Black power that fought anti-Black racism and advocated autonomy for Black people. Based on a shared cultural imaginary, these projects recognize Black people's disparate positioning around the world, yet shared conditions of oppression and racial exclusion, social memory of racial terror, resistance, and survival. New political spaces are opened up by diasporic interactions. Shared histories of colonization, displacement, racialization can form the basis for coalitions to resist racism, displacement, and violence. Yet, like Stuart Hall, I understand identity not to be an essence, but a political positioning. The linkages that tie diaspora together must be articulated and are not inevitable. These linkages are always historically constituted by people who choose to take on a diasporic identity and politics. As a transnational identity and politics, diaspora opens the possibility of the emergence of new forms of indigenous sovereignty. James Clifford reminds us that while diaspora practices are defined and constrained by the nation-state structure, they, quote, exceed and criticize them at the same time. Old and new diasporas offer resources for emergent post-colonialisms, end quote. A politics of Palestinian diaspora has, in a previous era, held the potential to create and exceed the nation-state. A reading of this archive of resistance is instructive in reimagining Palestinian sovereignty today. Palestinian diaspora politics. Since its inception, Palestinian diaspora, mobilized by the Nakba and Israeli settler colonial processes, has been deeply tied to political projects involved in creating consciousness and solidarity among Palestinian people dispersed throughout the globe. The rise of a diasporic Palestinian politics was aided by the rise of pan-Arab nationalism in the 1950s to 1960s, whose ideology included Palestinian liberation and continued through the 70s and 80s with the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization and its power and influence within Arab states, in the League of Arab States, and internationally. Diasporic Palestinian politics was based on a unified territorial claim, a notion of Palestinian cultural and political identity tied to that territorial claim, a conviction to liberate Palestine and implement the right of return through a militant strategy of armed struggle. At its height, institutionalization in itself became a form of struggle, and the PLO formed a deterritorialized state that served as a foundation for organized resistance and state formation. PLO institution building in exile included a parliament, the Palestine National Council, a government, the Executive Committee, and a military apparatus, the PLA. But the division of the PLO, beginning with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, disrupted Palestinian institution building, fragmented this mobile state in exile, and the diasporic body politic. In 1994, the PLO signed the Oslo Accords, which created what was supposed to be a temporary interim Palestinian authority and the Palestinian Legislative Council. The PA's task was to build the institutions of an independent Palestinian state within 5 years. 19 years later, it has failed to achieve even the most basic rights Palestinians living under military occupation and apartheid so urgently need. Instead, the Oslo agreements and the PA have further fragmented the Palestinian people. Thank you. Institutionalizing division between Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and importantly, between Palestinians situated inside occupied Palestine, 48, and those living in neighboring Arab states and throughout the wider diaspora. What was once a thriving internationalist revolutionary movement for Palestinian liberation, based on PLO institution building and led by the PNC, the PLO's governing body, was transformed into a liberal state-building enterprise focused on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, an enterprise that, as we all know too well, ultimately aided Israel's settler colonial expansion. In effect, the PLO's power and legitimacy as sole representative of the Palestinian people has been evacuated. How might we both refigure ourselves as political subjects and reinvigorate Palestinian diaspora as political project? This rich history of Palestinian organization and resistance, of which diasporic identity and politics was a central part, serves us today as an archive from which to draw inspiration for rebuilding a collective sense of identity, unity, and a program for liberation of our people. The renewed call for PNC elections and the recent launch of the popular campaign for registration, which I will turn to now, presents a timely and powerful model for reuniting the Palestinian people worldwide, reigniting this process of Palestinian institution building as a groundwork for forming a new political strategy to serve our time and our generation, and rehabilitating the Palestinian body politic. Toward a new politics of Palestinian diaspora. On January 27, 2011, the Union of Palestinian Youth of the General Union of Palestinian Students staged a sit-in protest at the London office of the Palestinian Liberation Organization to, quote, begin a national initiative to campaign for direct elections to the Palestinian National Council on the clear understanding that only a reformed national representative institution that includes the will of all Palestinians, those struggling in the homeland and those struggling in exile, can create a representative Palestinian platform and restore the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The students called for three things: direct elections to the Palestinian National Council, the parliamentary body that gives authority to and creates the political platform, strategies, and policies for the Palestinian Liberation Organization; the inclusion of all of our people, wherever they now live, in the homeland, the Shatat, and in the prisons and the camps of refuge; and that this new representative body, reflective of all sectors of our people, reform and reactivate the PLO institutions so that they embody the will of the Palestinian people as a whole, in accordance with the principle of direct elections. Following this statement, in 2012, Palestinian leaders from across the political spectrum in occupied Palestine and throughout the diaspora issued a national call for registration to the PNC. The call, based on national consensus building and reconciliation agreements, which have stressed the need to hold PNC elections, quote, encourages broadening democratic participation in Palestinian national institutions and calls on Palestinians everywhere to participate in the civic registration drive, end quote. Just 2 weeks ago, Palestinians in Syria's Yarmouk refugee camp became the first in the diaspora to register to vote in this registration process for Palestinian National Council elections. The Popular Campaign for Registration, the group working to implement demands for the PNC elections, announced the official launch of the historic registration drive 2 weeks ago adding, quote, "We call upon all our people in the occupied homeland and all other countries to take the initiative and to push the registration process forward in all locations, overcoming barriers and obstacles toward the birth of a new Palestine National Council, elected, inclusive, and capable of unifying the national will toward the long-awaited goals of liberation and return," end quote. The practical organizing aspects of the registration drive are as follows. Palestinians and Palestinian civic associations throughout the diaspora will be trained to operate registration centers in their locality. Members of the Palestinian diaspora will visit registration centers in their locality, submit documentation verifying their identity, and will register through a centralized online registration system. The registration drive offers a way forward in building a new politics of Palestinian diaspora through, number one, inviting communities around the world to engage and participate in redefining what it means to be Palestinian today, reigniting a collective sense of identity and cultural and political practice. Number two, energizing Palestinians to build collectivities in multiple locations, collectivities that will ultimately shape a newly unified political strategy for the Palestinian people. And number three, allowing the Palestinian people to play a role in rebuilding Palestinian institutions and reinvigorating the PLO as a truly legitimate representative body of the Palestinian people through democratic elections to the PNC. Challenges and critiques. I now want to address some of the challenges and critiques of the registration drive. I'm going to try and cut the academic talk and make it plain. Yesterday, our friend Ziad Abbas spoke about the contradiction of approaching a project of national liberation with elections. This is clearly a critical point of intervention. There are major risks of relying solely on a liberal rights-based framework as a way of figuring our political subjectivity. We've seen the way this culture of assimilation through rights affected us after Oslo. The discourse of state building tied to this liberal rights regime replaced our focus on national liberation and fragmented our people. First, it's important to clearly differentiate between the registration drive and future elections to the PNC. The Popular Campaign for Registration, the campaign's coordinating body, is not responsible for the elections themselves. There is no political statement or political position attached to the Popular Campaign for Registration. The campaign is calling on the Palestinian people throughout the diaspora, including all of those sitting here today, to organize where we are and exercise our rights to make a political statement. It's not anyone's place to call for one state, two states, the peace process, or any of the other formulations on the table. What we need now is to hear every Palestinian's voice. The campaign is working to ensure that every Palestinian who wants to take part in this decision-making process has the ability to do so. It's about giving the power and the responsibility back to the Palestinian people worldwide to define and determine our own destiny. The registration campaign is also a civic responsibility. It's about raising awareness about what the PNC is, about recovering this radical history of the PLO and giving people an understanding of what it means to elect a PNC, that it's one of the rights of Palestinians enshrined all around the world. It's an initiative to help people understand and practice their rights. In short, the registration drive itself is not about the election. It's about organizing. It's about groundwork, reuniting our people around the world, understanding the hopes and dreams of our people and of our generation, rebuilding a sense of collective identity and a new foundation, framework, and strategy for our collective liberation. Second, when we do speak about PNC elections, we're not talking about elections in the American sense. Eventual elections to the PNC will not be an end in and of itself, but a beginning, a reopening of public space that has been confiscated by political parties, Palestinian elites, and international bodies. Creating this space for elections makes it clear that sovereignty and legitimacy comes from the people. The elections are not about democratization or about a state parliament in that sense. There's a huge difference between electing a government for a state and addressing state issues and electing leadership for a liberation movement, and that's what this is about. Another major critique is that emanating from the PYM, which Charlotte mentioned yesterday, the Palestinian Youth Movement. They ask, why should we reclaim and refound our national organizations? Why not just build new ones? First, this campaign for registration and calling for renewing the PLO through PNC elections is not new. It started in 1998 with the Civitas project. There's a report online that you can access called Palestinians Register detailing this project, which was a huge effort lasting many years to understand Palestinian people throughout the diaspora's desires and relationship to the PLO. An overwhelming consensus emerged from this process that the Palestinian people around the world want to reclaim the PLO as their representative institution. Our people in the camps and on the ground, they fought, they resisted, they sacrificed to build a national liberation movement, and these organizations and institutions were a central part of that movement. Second, at this point, building new bodies with this kind of relationship to the people is a luxury. No real alternatives have been presented. The danger of a lack of political representation is real and it is urgent. Our people in Syria and Lebanon are dying because there isn't a political body that is representing or protecting their interests. Additional questions that come to mind about the PNC election itself. Who will be the candidates that the global Palestinian people can elect to the PNC? Can they be situated in the diaspora, or will they need to live in the homeland? What is the relationship between PNC elections and the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? I want to thank my friend Nada Elia for raising these questions with me. Considering that BDS is now widely recognized as a strategy for liberation, will this representative PNC have to endorse BDS as the will of the Palestinian people? Or will the newly elected PNC fragment the Palestinian people by proposing a more mainstream, less grassroots strategy? Or alternatively, will the PNC be elected to get to work after the success of BDS? These questions and many more are unresolved and must be debated and decided upon by the Palestinian people worldwide. I invite the audience here today to discuss and debate these ideas. In conclusion, political representation of the diaspora is central to any project of return. The registration campaign is, in effect, a Palestinian consciousness-building movement capable of reigniting a collective sense of cultural and political identity, reinvigorating Palestinian diaspora as a political project, rebuilding a model of transformative resistance for the Palestinian people worldwide, and implementing an innovative form of indigenous sovereignty. And it has the potential to bring all of us together as a people again, from my relatives who never left Palestine to my distant cousins in Cuba. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these ambitious presentations. And I don't see anybody lining up for questions. I suppose this is a sign of fatigue, or do I have to give some time for people to? Okay, good. Come. I'll take 3 questions if there are, and then I'll make my comments and let the 2 speakers comment on them. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Okay, hi. My name is Josette Souza. I'm with Brown Students for Justice in Palestine. This question is to Sarah. I'm wondering, do you think the diasporans of the Palestinian diaspora have the same amount of right or say in what happens in Palestine? And if not, or if so, would you please explain that and what the implications are for that? Thank you.
Anybody else?
I actually have another question, but I was just going to wait.
Somebody wants to make.
Yep. I just want to know what is the implication of using the word arbitrary. I've seen that used several times, and none of this seems very arbitrary to me. It seems very, so when they say arbitrary, removal of people from areas, it doesn't seem very arbitrary to me, so why use that word?
Thanks very much for your presentations. I just have a question to, I guess, to the panel in general that kind of applies maybe separately to the separate presentations. It was very interesting to hear the discussion of the PNC election campaign in the framework of rebuilding a Palestinian national liberation movement in terms of what rebuilding the PLO means and what that could look like. And especially in the context of the second paper, in terms of the discussion of federalism and amassing political capital and lobbying, and how that would actually interact with the national liberation movement that is struggling against an entrenched settler colonial state with the support of the US, which hasn't suddenly come around to being convinced with some money to support Israel, but is in fact the provider of support and aid to Israel. And I don't want to speak, and I want to let you speak, but just to ask the question also, when you speak about federalism and binationalism, that there's a very large difference between sort of like a set of states having votes for a House of Representatives and talking about binationalism, which is a racialized definition of who is part of a federation and who isn't. Mm-hmm. And to clearly distinguish that from what was said by the person from Fatah, which you quoted in 1969, which was about talking about one democratic state, not about binationalism, and that those two things are very separate contexts. I also just wanted to problematize and maybe ask a bit about the context of Canadian federalism, because when we talk about Canadian federalism and also US federalism, we're talking about ways of integrating Quebec, for example, which are still being challenged by movements within Quebec and still existing inequalities that exist there, as well as the fact that all of those federal structures are still settler colonial structures sitting on top of indigenous land. And so how do we deal with that, and how do we talk about federalism when we're not talking about uprooting colonialism in the first place and using those as examples? So I just kind of wanted to throw those out for all of you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and I'll give my set of comments. This way you can each have 5 minutes then to answer them. Just to follow up a little bit on that, I'll start with Sarah's point about the importance of reviving the PNC election. And I think in that context, you might find that you need to address, or you might want to address, this big challenge between how do we combine popular representation with political expediency and ability to translate that into a political project that is acceptable to the various Palestinian population, and at the same time, you can cash politically. What do I mean practically? I think you need to think in terms, or it would be helpful to think, who can lead for the time being the Palestinian national movement, and what is the relationship between grassroots activism and party politics. The importance of grassroots activism is to emphasize the right of citizens to their rights, to claim their rights. Often they're not interested in political power, they're interested in making power accountable and being representative. But whoever, we see it today with the Arab Spring, we see it in Tunisia, we see it in Egypt. Political activism has been very important to lead the revolution, but the one who's cashing or trying to cash in the results of the revolution are the political parties. And if you're not organized in a political party like the Muslim Brothers or others, you are not going to get your demands fulfilled in the game of power. So that dimension is important to bear in mind, how we can, on the one hand, have the importance of the PNC elections and using the bodies that we already have today, with how you're going to translate that into a political project. And in that respect, I think the Palestinians inside 48 have a central role to play here. Because, and in a sense, that historical moment has arrived for them to lead the Palestinian national movement. This doesn't mean that they take the place of the Palestinian diaspora or in the West Bank or the Gaza. No, everybody is involved in, but those who can best frame a debate of a one state, those who can best address whether we are in a binational or in a secular democratic state might be the Palestinian inside 48. And as I said, historically, that's the moment where we reach people. Now, concerning Sadia, I think, there is a tension in your paper between federalism and majoritarian rule and the meaning of binationalism. I don't agree with the last intervention about binationalism being a form of racism. No, exactly. Nationalism is not, if you consider nationalism to be a form of racism, then okay, every nationalism is racism. But nationalism is really a talk about collective rights. People who claim that they form a national group, however much you think this is right or not right, but if you believe that people have collective rights, the question is how do you fulfill collective rights without having it at the expense of other people? So this is why the idea of a binational state is not something that tries to rationalize politics or implement racial politics, but rather to deal with the concept of collective rights for two people who speak different languages, who they have different history, who have intersecting history, but are coming from different places, versus the secular democratic state, which can definitely defend individual rights, but you get stuck with a major problem that what do we do with people who don't identify as Arab? What do you do with people who don't identify as Palestinian? What do you do with people who don't identify as Israelis? How do you combine 2 people, 3 people, 10 people who want to have their individual and collective rights protected while acknowledging, as you rightly said, the issues of colonialism, ascetic colonialism, rather negated. This gets answered through a transitional justice mechanism. So to Sadia is precisely how you need to be aware of binationalism in the Palestinian-Israeli context. It's not clear how it can be resolved by keeping the West Bank as is or keeping the central region of Israel. You might think that there's something more to learn from the Swiss example or the Belgian example than actually from the American or the Canadian example.
All right, to Josette, was that? Josette, thank you for your question, sister, and it's so great to see SJP represented at this conference. Yeah, SJP. So, do diasporas have, do all diasporic communities have the same, or should they have the same amount of rights as the refugees? That's the question, correct? Yeah. I think that's a great question, a very interesting one, and I think that in terms of this imagining diasporic communities, obviously there's a multiplicity of Palestinian communities, a multiplicity of ways of being Palestinian today, a multiplicity of relationships to power. I was reminded of this just 3 weeks ago. I was in Beirut and had the privilege of visiting many of the camps and talking to a lot of our people in the camps. And it was a very difficult experience, learning that many of our brothers and sisters, do not have, as we learned throughout this weekend, access to the most basic political rights or any kind of representation. They were telling me, we don't have employment, we don't have the right to own property, we don't have enough food to put on the table. We need assistance now. We need solidarity now. I think that it's an open question, but that the critical thing is building solidarity between Palestinian communities today, of reigniting kind of a sense of collectivity and being able to utilize our disparate positions in relationship to power that we have, me as a United States citizen, et cetera, in order to strengthen that solidarity between Palestinian communities that will ultimately form the basis for uniting our people again and projecting and implementing a project of return and liberation.
Sure. Yes. So your name's Charlotte, right? Yeah. So I suppose that in terms of your first question, well, in terms of binational citizenry, I want you to understand that by binational state, I don't mean it as in terms that the state itself has institutionalized a binational. It's not the binationalism isn't necessarily institutionalized. It's descriptive. As in, this state is comprised of 2 nationalities, 2 nations. I don't mean it in terms of, that the state itself is going to discriminate against anyone who does not fall into one of the 2 nationalities. That being said, in terms of your second question was about what about lobbies that already support the United States, and why are we discussing federalism without discussing how to uproot apartheid? I completely understand that question, but when you think about it, the premise for my paper is that the return has already been implemented, that Palestinians have already been allowed to return. What are we going to do now that they've been allowed to return? What kind of governmental structure can accommodate the needs of the growing Palestinian population on the one hand, and on the other, the minority rights? And federalism has typically in the past presented an excellent way of balancing these interests. In terms of lobbies, I'm actually very surprised that you say that. I suppose most of you have read Walt and Mearsheimer's book on the Israel lobby, right? So, and I think that should teach us that, the reality in the United States, I've worked with a lobbying organization in the past myself. So the reality in the United States political scene is that there is a way to push for policy change. And one of the most important ways of pushing for policy change is through through the system, to understand how the system works, which unfortunately, as Edward Said said the PLO is not very well versed in how the American government system works. And I think it would really behoove us to learn how it works and to also begin to organize some kind of system so that we can also combat vested Zionist interests ourselves. Exactly.
So in terms of your questions, Doctor, thank you so much. I think these are, oh, sorry, yes. I think these are really important questions and things that need to be addressed moving forward. Absolutely, I don't have the answers to them. But to me, this whole issue of PNC elections and who can lead the national movement for the time being is still one step ahead of the game. That's why I find the popular registration campaign so inspiring that so many young people are involved in, because it's really about figuring out what our dreams are as a people again, reigniting a sense of collectivity, reigniting kind of an international consciousness around what it means to be Palestinian, about what we want for ourselves and our communities and our futures, and defining what political leadership looks like to us in our generation, what our political project or projects will look like in our generation. And in terms of who can lead for the time being the Palestinian national movement, we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. And I think, and that is why, again, this registration campaign is so important, I think. It gives all of us as Palestinians the ability to participate in redefining who we are, in redefining the kind of leadership that we want, and in participating and taking the responsibility, because it is a responsibility that we all need to take upon ourselves as Palestinian people, especially our younger generation, with all the resources, with all the creativity that we have. And it's our responsibility to become those leaders. So, thank you.
Yes, I also wanted to say that I do think that this is in no way to detract from the grassroots activism that many student activists engage in. I think that we need that, but the BDS campaign is an example of that. But then in addition to that, I also think that we need to have institutions that are organized in order to push for policy change with like congressional leaders, for instance, that have these contacts, that have the resources, honestly, because I think we also lack many of the resources. And I think that that's another effort that we really should be pushing toward.
Joseph's gonna kill me. I wanted two things quickly, a corrective. I think, Sara, you said BDS was a liberation movement. And well, someone said that, so I just to clarify, it's not, it's something for solidarity to do. It's a tactic. It's not part of that liberation, even, I guess, discourse. The question is for Sara, however. I felt in your talk, you began to talk about the diaspora politics as a people in exile able to exist without the nation state or outside of it. And yet your conclusion was one that distilled the need for resuscitating a diaspora politics and diaspora formation for a utilitarian purpose of electing an accountable government. And I think in between those two things, which are both worthwhile, is this notion and the possibility that could a diaspora government or a people in exile exist for the sole purpose of maintaining a national body regardless of or bifurcated from even a liberation movement? And I'm not suggesting that it's done, but I'm wondering what the virtue of that is for us to consider because of everything inherent to diaspora and identity movement.
Thank you so much. My name is Gabrielle. I had a question. What do you think are the implications for using mobilizing South Africa as an example of success through using it as understanding as a binational project when the continued reality is economic and collective violence and apartheid there?
Thank you, Noura, so much for that question. It's a really important question. I did start out kind of defining diaspora from an African diaspora perspective, more of the roots, what's called a roots approach, which looks at kind of a teleological notion of return to a territory, a space, and things like that. And I don't have an answer to your question, but I do think that for me, the productivity of imagining Palestinian politics in a previous era and today in terms of diasporic politics is that possibility of both looking toward a territory, a land, and looking at that relationship between ourselves as a people and Palestine, the land, and also transcending these modern concepts like the nation state and things like that by organizing internationally and potentially having representative bodies that are placed outside of the homeland, depending on what our disparate communities decide for themselves, whether or not they want to return. So it's an open question, but thank you very much for posing it.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'll have to stop because we have to do the next panel. Sorry about that, but thank you very much for our speakers, and I think we're going to now move to the last.
So thank